Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's virtual book club gathering. I'm Professor Jane O. Newman. I'm a professor of comparative literature at the University of California at Irvine, and I'm a trustee of the National Humanities Center, and I'm your host for this evening's event. Before we get started, though, we want to make sure that you all have the opportunity to pose questions to our speaker tonight. So I want to remind everyone that to participate in this discussion, you'll need to log into YouTube using your Gmail account. Just click on the blue sign-in button in the upper right corner of the screen and just follow the prompts. If you don't have a Gmail account, you can either easily create one for free by following the instructions on the sign-in page. Now let's turn to this evening's discussion. Throughout the summer, millions of protesters have gathered across the United States, as well as in cities abroad, insisting that we address the many forms of anti-Black racism that have plagued our country for generations. Our guest this evening is Professor Martin Summers. He teaches in the Department of History and the program in African and African Diaspora Studies at Boston College. Martin is an award-winning cultural historian whose work on issues of race, gender, and sexuality and medicine in the 19th and 20th centuries, US, has been supported with numerous fellowships from the Ford Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and the National Humanities Center, who's hosting this event this evening. Martin's first book, Manliness and Its Discontents, The Black Middle Class and the Transformation of Masculinity, 1900 to 1930, received the American Historical Association Pacific Coast Branch's Book Award in 2005. That book examines how African-American and African-Caribbean immigrant men in the early 20th century constructed modern masculine identities through their own organizational life, work, leisure, and cultural production, and were not simply screens onto which white men projected their own gender anxieties and concerns. While at the National Humanities Center as a fellow in 2013-14, Martin conducted work on his most recent book, Madness in the City of Magnificent Intentions, which considers how assumptions about the existence of distinctively Black and white psyches have affected the lives of patients and caregivers at St. Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C., our country's first federally operated psychiatric hospital. Martin has kindly agreed to speak with us this evening about his work on St. Elizabeth's and to reflect on how racialized approaches to medicine have affected the lives of African Americans in our nation's capital. So please join me, if you will, in welcoming Professor Martin Summers to speak to us this evening. Martin?
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for the introduction. And I want to thank Robert Newman for inviting me to participate in this series and for Jane Newman for hosting. I also want to thank the National Humanities Center. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that this book would not exist without the NHC. The fellowship in 2013, 2014 really came at a time after I had been working on this project for over 10 years, and I was on deck to take on a significant administrative role at my home institution, and I couldn't foresee completing the book for several years after that. But this very timely fellowship allowed me to get a lot of writing done and then carry that momentum over into the year, my first year as director of African and African Diaspora Studies. So I'm really thankful for National Humanities Center for providing me the resources and the space to write. And I also would like to thank Ruth and A. Morris Williams for their generosity in funding the fellowship. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, give an overview of the book, and also touch on some themes that I think speak to some of the contemporary issues that the nation is confronting today, over policing of communities of color, and also the role of the police in crisis management of people with mental illness. But I'd first like to just give a little bit of a background on St. Elizabeth's itself. So just bear with me. Okay, good. So St. Elizabeth's was established in 1855 with a mandate to house and treat insane soldiers and sailors, as well as residents, civilian residents of the District of Columbia, who were too poor to afford private treatment. And this is an early image of St. Elizabeth's shortly after its opening. At its peak, it housed approximately 8,000 patients. And this is an aerial view of the hospital in the mid 1970s. And as you can see here, hopefully you can see my cursor, this is the original center building, but all of this was the St. Elizabeth's campus, and it was located, I should say, in the southeastern quadrant of Washington, DC. St. Elizabeth's was considered a preeminent research and teaching hospital from the late 19th to the mid 20th century. It was one of the first asylums to introduce hydrotherapy as a form of treatment in the late 19th century. Its superintendent in the first third of the 20th century, William Allinson White, was a proponent of psychoanalysis, and so it was among the few mental institutions to actually use psychotherapy as a method of treatment. And one of the American popularizers of the lobotomy, William Freeman, worked at St. Elizabeth's in the 1930s. But what also makes St. Elizabeth's an important institution was that it was one of the few hospitals in the country prior to the 1950s to have a racially heterogeneous patient population. There were other mental institutions in the US and particularly in the South that had African-American patients, such as Eastern Lunatic Asylum in Williamsburg, Virginia, which had African-American patients from its founding in 1773 to 1870. And then the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum in Columbia, I believe, South Carolina, that had Black patients from 1848 to the 1920s. But those Black patients at Eastern and South Carolina lunatic asylums constituted a fairly small percentage of the total patient population, as opposed to St. Elizabeth's, which by the 1890s, 40% of the patient population was Black. So the significant presence of Black patients at St. Elizabeth's really provided me an opportunity to examine how race and racism shaped psychiatric ideas and practices from the mid-19th to the late 20th century. So I develop or make two main arguments in the book. The first main argument is that ideas about racial difference influenced how psychiatrists at St. Elizabeth's thought about insanity and mental health, and subsequently developed approaches to address them. From the mid-19th century to the mid-20th, psychiatrists believed that the Black psyche was fundamentally different from the white psyche. And this really contributed to a psychiatric consensus that Black mental illness was distinctive from a white mental illness. Mentally ill Black people were essentially thought to be more depraved and dangerous than mentally ill white people. And this is evident in the decisions, this belief in this kind of fundamentally different Black insanity was evident in the decisions made by the hospital's founders when they designed the hospital. So for instance, Black patients were housed in buildings that were at a distance from the center building. And here is a layout of the hospital. Again, this is that center building, which we've seen in previous images. And as you can see here, this is a lodge for colored women and a lodge for colored men. And they were pretty much situated equidistantly between the center building that housed white patients And as you can see here, the physical plant, the stables, machine shops, and things like that. So basically the housing of Black patients, the design of the hospital itself really reproduced the racial topography of the plantation. Now, these decisions on how to house African-American patients were really based on and reinforced the belief that the white psyche was the norm, and that the white sufferer of mental illness should take precedence over the Black sufferer of mental illness. And I think it's important to kind of recognize that the racial segregation of patients at St. Elizabeth's was not just a manifestation of the racial segregation that existed in the larger society, but rather it was justified by a therapeutic logic that held that exposure to the depravity and the dangerousness of mentally ill Blacks would impede the recovery of white patients. But this belief in the normative nature of the white psyche also produced a great deal of ambiguity when it came to psychiatrists' attempts to comprehend insanity among Black people. These questions of what actually constituted Black madness and how did it differ from the insanity experienced by whites, despite an a priori assumption about racial difference, really characterized psychiatrists' interaction with Black sufferers of mental illness. And we see this in a few ways. For instance, the admission of Black patients to St. Elizabeth's to begin with. Black patients were admitted to St. Elizabeth's despite the mid-19th century medical consensus that people of African descent and enslaved and quote unquote primitive people possessed a natural immunity to insanity. And physicians attempted to explain this immunity to insanity, both physiologically as well as culturally. So physiologically, they argued that since insanity essentially was a deterioration of the nervous system, the brain and the nervous system, that primitive peoples, and in this case, African Americans, did not have sufficiently developed nervous systems or brains to deteriorate in the first place. But they also pointed to cultural reasons to explain this immunity to insanity among African Americans. And that argument basically posited that enslavement itself offered protection to Black people from the stresses and strains of modern society that might precipitate mental illness and mental deterioration. So this ambiguity made it somewhat challenging for me to interpret the sources and get a clear sense of how 19th century psychiatrists thought about Black insanity. And I'd like to just read a short passage from the second chapter of the book, which looks at the hospital shortly after the Civil War, and again, kind of the interaction or how African American patients were thought about by St. Elizabeth's physicians. So, of the approximately 280 African Americans admitted to St. Elizabeth's in the first 2 decades of its existence, perhaps the most enigmatic case is that of Letitia B. The 39-year-old native Virginian was admitted to the hospital almost a year to the day after the end of the Civil War. Residence was not typically listed in the hospital's register, so we do not know if Letitia was a longtime denizen of Washington, if she lived in one of the district's 4 tenement complexes set up and run by the Freedmen's Bureau, or if she was an inmate of one of the camps located in Northern Virginia, whose officials may have managed to circumvent Superintendent Nichols' opposition to accepting Virginia refugees as public wards. There's very little about Letitia that is actually remarkable. Like more than 2/3 of African Americans admitted to the hospital in 1866, she was an insane pauper. Her diagnosis of mania was not unusual either. Since the beginning of the hospital's operation, 63% of the African Americans admitted were diagnosed with some form of mania. What makes Lutetia a particularly interesting case is the cause of her insanity. Similar to most of her fellow African American inmates, the diagnosing physician attributed Lutetia's mania mainly to moral, in contrast to physical causes. As opposed to the small number whose insanity was thought to be brought on directly by an underlying bodily infirmity, such as epilepsy, pulmonary tuberculosis, idiocy, or paralysis, the sanity of the majority of admitted African Americans was disrupted by unnerving events or processes, such as religious excitement, the death of a close family member, alienation from their social network, domestic trouble, fright, or jealousy. But even with the elastic and amorphous quality of moral causation, it is difficult to make sense of the precipitating factor in Lutetia's descent into madness, the quote, blackness of her husband. The opacity of the early register books at St. Elizabeth's makes it impossible to fully understand what the hospital staff meant by this provocative phrase. She was admitted several decades before hospitals began creating and maintaining patient case files, and there are therefore few clues to Lutetia's commitment. Was the blackness of her husband the considered opinion of one of the two physicians who had to attest to her insanity? And if so, was the doctor literally referring to the man's skin color? The medical profession generally accepted the proposition that insanity could occur when an underlying morbid condition was aggravated by, quote, a powerful impression from without producing some great moral shock. As such, Lutetia's husband's dark complexion might very well have been the catalyst as far as the diagnosing physician was concerned, although presumably Lutetia would have been accustomed to it. Or did the phrase mean something less tangible, such as her ill treatment at her husband's hands, his black-heartedness, as it were? If so, was the information provided to the physicians by one of the two district householders who had to confirm Lutetia's inability to self-support, or by Lutetia herself? The possibilities are many, but all are ultimately nothing more than speculation. Lutetia's presence jumps off the page of the hospital's registry, demanding our attention, and is at the same time frustratingly confined by the limits of the record-keeping process. Nothing more than a few words jotted down, perhaps by an uninterested clerk who is merely following institutional procedure. Nonetheless, the cryptic reference to blackness is emblematic of how race loomed over clinical encounters between white physicians and African American patients, even if the sources are not always precisely clear how it did so. So this ambiguity made it somewhat challenging to interpret the sources and really get a clear sense of how 19th century psychiatrists thought about insanity. So for instance, the ambiguity that we're talking about really lies in this source. But in a more general sense, uncertainty about the relationship between race and mental illness can be seen in psychiatric discourse itself. We see this in psychiatrists' attempts to explain the epidemic of insanity among newly freed people in the post-emancipation period, and especially in the 1880s and the 1890s. And again, I'll just read a short passage, and this will be the last passage that I read before just finishing with the rest of the talk. In the late 1880s, the Australian physician George A. Tucker published Lunacy in Many Lands, an encyclopedic volume containing information on scores of asylums that he had visited in the first half of the decade. In addition to his personal observations, excerpts from annual reports, and texts of lunacy legislation, Tucker included the responses that superintendents gave to a survey he had distributed. St. Elizabeth's was one of the asylums that Tucker toured. Perhaps it was the hospital's location in the Upper South or the sizable African-American population in the district in the 1880s that prompted Tucker to inquire whether St. Elizabeth's superintendent had observed an increase in the prevalence of insanity among the colored. But his response was very telling. Very marked, Superintendent W.W. Godding claimed, I think largely growing out of their emancipation. Washington was a city of refuge to which contrabands flocked during the war, and the entire change in their modes of life, the added cares, the new ambitions awakened, the struggle for existence under circumstances by no means the most favorable. All the trials of the transition period from slave to citizen, without the advantage that in time may be expected to accrue from the latter. All of these have had their effect in greater mental strain and consequent increase of insanity. Godding was so certain that emancipation had contributed to the mental distress of African Americans that he answered in the affirmative Tucker's question as to whether there was an increase in insanity in the district beyond the increase in population. Although he suspected that this was the case with whites as well, it was difficult to state so definitively because of the district's high rate of transiency. He was without a doubt when it came to the city's Black residents. Godding's response to Tucker's survey reflected a prominent strain within the national debate over the Negro problem in the post-emancipation era. A population that had overwhelmingly been enslaved, African Americans were not deemed equal by whites of any political persuasion, despite their nominal citizenship after 1868. The general consensus among whites, Northern and Southern, Republican and Democrat, was that freed people were incapable of adapting to their new civil status without the assistance of their more civilized counterparts. That assistance could range, depending on where one fell on the ideological spectrum, from advocacy of industrial education to compulsory labor. Alongside this new paternalism existed a more malevolent attitude toward African Americans, one that considered them to be completely incapable of surviving and flourishing outside of the relationships of dependency that slavery had engendered. Without the security of bondage, this line of thinking went, freed people would revert to their savage ancestral past and eventually become extinct, potentially rending the social fabric of the nation in the process. The childlike Negro would prefer engaging in criminal activity to honest labor, would easily allow his vote to be manipulated by corrupt political parties, and would mistake his political power for a license to sexually assault white women. Along with segregation, which also ultimately became a cornerstone of the new paternalism, disfranchisement and extra-legal violence purportedly functioned as safeguards against the regressing African American. Proponents of this particular post-emancipation narrative pointed to increased rates of crime and disease among African Americans as evidence of their inability to adjust to their new lives as free people. An alleged epidemic of rapes and attempted rapes of white women in the late 19th century was taken to indicate the utter lack of self-control of the Negro, a problem that was best resolved by lynching and more community-engulfing violence, such as the race riots in Wilmington in 1898 and New Orleans in 1900. From a disease standpoint, according to this narrative, the higher incidence of tuberculosis and syphilis within Black communities revealed the inherently weaker constitutions of African Americans and, not coincidentally, reinforced the Southern apologist argument that slavery had been a benevolent and salutary institution. In addition to growing rates of certain somatic diseases, as Godding's answer to Tucker reveals, the medical community suggested that increased diagnoses of insanity were further telltale signs that freedom ultimately had a deleterious effect on African American health. Freed people, the argument went, were ill-equipped to handle the stresses and strains that were natural to an existence in the competitive modern world. Within this logic, insanity was still largely defined as a disease of civilization, a refrain that would continue into the early 20th century. As asylum physicians continue to conceptualize mental illness as an affliction of the most cerebrally advanced races, its growing presence within a race that was supposedly in the process of becoming more primitive presented a theoretical problem concerning the etiology of insanity. One of the ways they sought to resolve this contradiction was to deploy an evolutionary argument that emphasized racial degeneracy and the lack of civilizational advancement of people of African descent. Degeneration rather than evolution became the principal explanatory model for increasing rates of insanity. When Godin responded to George Tucker's survey in the 1880s, he was illustrating his adherence to this freedom equals racial degeneration narrative that had been circulating for at least a dozen years, and that the medical profession would continue to advance for another 2 decades. For Godin, the apparent increase in mental illness among African Americans was not a result of insane Blacks who would have ordinarily remained on plantations or in households under the care of slaveholders, or their families, now coming within the purview of the state. Rather, the soaring rates of insanity could best be explained by the incomplete transition that African Americans were undergoing from the status of slave to the now burdensome role of citizen. Although he was hardly an apologist for slavery, Godin, like so many other asylum physicians and neurologists, unquestioningly accepted this particular narrative of emancipation and repeated it until it became common sense, an irrefutable argument that both explained African Americans' lack of progress and justified their continued discriminatory treatment. So as that passage points out, physicians or psychiatrists really attributed these increasing rates of insanity, supposed increasing rates of insanity among the African-American population to freedom, but they could not develop a consensus as to whether insanity was precipitated by physical underdevelopment, again, an underdeveloped nervous system, or cultural underdevelopment, that is, Black society lacking institutions and cultural norms to assist in coping with stress. So in a sense, for the psychiatric profession, Black insanity really constituted an epistemological problem. But it was this kind of ambiguity that really underpinned the therapeutic approaches that ranged from racial ambivalence to racist antipathy. One of the things that this book does is explore the coexistence of a belief in racial difference, a racist belief in Black inferiority, a grudging acknowledgement of sameness, and a commitment to the medical mission of treating the mentally ill. In many ways, St. Elizabeth's psychiatrists, a therapeutic approach to Black patients was influenced by vernacular attitudes about the Negro character. And an example of this is the housing of Black male patients. The major therapeutic paradigm of the 19th and early 20th century, which is known as moral treatment, really dictated that mentally ill people be removed from their sources of stress and housed with people suffering the same disease. Despite this, from the 1880s to the 1930s, African-American male patients were housed in the same building and later complexed with insane convicts and the criminally insane, regardless of their diagnosis or civil status. And this is really influenced by the larger cultural narrative that associated Blackness with criminality. This cultural narrative fit well with the late 19th and early 20th century medical consensus that mentally ill Blacks were predisposed to mania rather than melancholia. And a psychiatrist's imagining of Black madness often associated with the most debased forms of white insanity. And so this is really perfectly encapsulated by a 1900 proposal by the kind of governing board of St. Elizabeth's to permanently locate all Black patients, including women, with the, quote, more disturbed and untidy white males on the other side of a main thoroughfare dividing the hospital campus. So other ways in which therapy was shaped by racist assumptions about innate Black character or its expectations about what would constitute recovery uh, include Black patients being more likely to be subjected to mechanical restraints or seclusion. This again reinforced ideas about Blacks as being naturally intractable and disorderly. Also, by the time you get to the early 20th century, when psychotherapy is becoming used more and more in the hospital, rather than using psychotherapy to get to the root cause of Black patients' mental disorders, psychiatrists used it to address the surface manifestation of their psychoses. And also to remediate their condition to the point that they could engage in labor, either inside the hospital or outside the hospital. And here are just two images of, again, some of these ideas and how they manifested in very concrete terms. This is a picture of Howard Hall, which was the facility that housed the criminally insane and insane convicts, as well as all Black male patients in the late 19th century. And you can see here with the fenced off area along the verandas, which again, kind of connect the Black male insanity to kind of additional confinement than normal, than quote unquote normal hospital patients, right? Kind of associating them with the need to actually confine them more in jail-like spaces rather than hospital-like spaces. And then in the foreground, you have this pile of dirt with shovels, which again associate Black mental patients with labor and the expectations that they would perform to menial labor on the campus. And in addition, Black female patients were almost exclusively used in the hospital's laundry, as well as essentially doing scullery work in the hospital's kitchens and dining rooms. So even after you see the emergence of post-World War II era consensus that race really plays no role in an individual's psychical responses to external stimuli, and also the desegregation of mental hospitals, ideas about racial difference really continue to persist. And you see this really with the increased disproportionate diagnoses of African Americans with schizophrenia once it becomes associated with violence and aggression in the 1960s and the 1970s. So I really don't have time to go into the second main argument that the book makes, because I really do want to, again, bring this a little forward to talk about the entanglement of Black mental illness and discourses of criminality, and as well as actual kind of law enforcement to the present. And I want to end by drawing just a few connections between the community mental health care movement and, as I said, the persistent entanglement of Black mental illness and law enforcement, which links up to the current crisis of policing and the movement for Black lives. The community mental health care movement was a noble effort by mental health experts and federal and state policymakers to address the problems of the post-war mental health care system, which was characterized by overcrowded, dilapidated state mental hospitals, high patient to staff ratios, really the absence of effective treatment regimes. In a sense, hospitals were more akin to custodial institutions than therapeutic or curative environments. In the 1960s and 1970s, community mental health care advocates envisioned a decentralization of mental health care delivery. Large state hospitals would be replaced with smaller mental health centers so that the mentally ill could be treated closer to their homes and families. Community mental health care would allow members of the community to have more of a say in what kinds of healthcare would be delivered and by whom. Experts and community residents also argued that interventions needed to be made before an individual's distressed state evolved into a condition that warranted institutionalization. And so this required, from their perspective, arming non-experts, such as teachers, clergy, social workers, and law enforcement officers with the knowledge and skills to serve as a first layer of assistance for mentally distressed people. At the same time, the community mental health care movement occurred alongside a patients' rights movement, in which mentally ill people who were institutionalized demanded first a right to treatment, and second, a right to treatment in the least restrictive setting. Many of the plaintiffs in these class action lawsuits, which occurred across the country, were African Americans who resided in urban areas, such as William Dixon here at the top of the page, who was the lead plaintiff in the case against St. Elizabeth's in the mid-1970s. He and others argued that they were involuntarily confined in a large mental hospital when they could instead receive treatment in alternative spaces such as halfway houses, foster homes, and nursing homes. The Dixon case led to large-scale release of patients, a process that we know as, now known as deinstitutionalization. And this was a progressive development in the long historical trajectory of treating the mentally ill. However, deinstitutionalization allowed states to pass off responsibility for funding of decentralized, for funding a decentralized mental health care system to local governments. And by the 1980s, there was very little federal support for community mental health care. As a result, deinstitutionalization led to rising rates of homelessness, with housing needs met largely by welfare hotels and homeless shelters. The shrinking of the state mental hospital system also contributed to rising rates of incarceration of mentally ill people. And so it's actually more accurate to refer to deinstitutionalization as trans-institutionalization, right? The movement of mentally ill people from mental hospitals to prisons, as well as nursing homes. And this has led to the appalling reality that American prisons are now the largest service provider for mentally ill people. And non-incarcerated people who are experiencing a mental health crisis are more likely to interact with police than mental health workers. So at this moment, when police and mass incarceration are the civil rights issues of our time, a defund the police movement has gained momentum. And this, of course, is based on, or included in this, is a recognition that police serve as first responders to problems that otherwise could be dealt with by social services. But there's an unfortunate irony in the fact that it was the community mental health care advocates themselves and their supporters in the 1960s and 1970s who argued that law enforcement should become more involved in community-wide efforts in addressing mental illness. And again, unfortunately, that initial noble vision of bringing the larger community into the care of the mentally ill was undermined by what continues to be a very anemic funding of social services in our society. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the conversation with our remaining hour, the remainder of that hour.
Gosh, Martin, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. And we have quite a number of listeners on our stream from North Carolina, Florida, Boston, Shaker Heights, Ohio, Philadelphia, out here in California. So there are quite a number of people who are really tuning in, quite interested in what you have to say. And we have several questions. Some of them you addressed, but maybe you could expand on them a little bit more. One of the questions was whether Black patients at St. Elizabeth's lived under different sort of security regimes than the white patients, and you addressed that. But then this notion that the Black men and women seem to have been housed together. Was that the case for the white patients as well? And how did this kind of play itself out, sort of spatially, if you will, and also in terms of the incarceration regimes?
Yeah, well, in general, Black male patients and Black female patients weren't housed together, although there was a brief period of time during the during the Civil War, when some of the facilities on the campus were being used as hospitals for Union soldiers. And that's actually one of the very interesting things, because this therapeutic paradigm of moral treatment not only argued that you needed to house people who were suffering, right, who had the same diagnosis together, but that you also had to segregate mentally ill people, not only on the basis of race, but also on the basis of gender. And so housing men and women together was anathema to psychiatrists in the mid-19th century. Yet, again, because there was scarce resources for African-American patients to begin with, Black men and women were housed together for a brief period of time. So in that sense, this inability to kind of respect, right, the existence of this conventional gender roles within the African American community really undermined the therapeutic vision of psychiatrists in the mid-19th century. I will say that again, I referred to this in my opening remarks. Yes, African American men. There were special security arrangements for African American men in the sense that they were housed in this facility for insane convicts and the criminally ill or criminally insane. There weren't, in terms of housing, there weren't kind of similar security arrangements for Black women, yet Black women were subjected to very kind of coercive forms of treatment disproportionately, right? And so, for instance, we think about hydrotherapy, which again was a very coercive form of treatment in the late 19th century. There's clear evidence that hospital staff used hydrotherapy to discipline unruly Black women, much more so than they would use it to discipline unruly white women.
Interesting. We just had another question related to this. Were the administrators of the facility and the physicians and the caretakers and so on, were they African American or were they white? Was there?
No, that's a great question, and I'm sorry that that wasn't clear at the beginning of throughout the talk, really. So the administration, the hospital staff, and were white, and it's not until, and then by hospital staff, I'm not only talking about the physicians, the kind of second physicians, they were known as well as the nurses and attendants. It's not really until the 1930s and 1940s when you begin to see the integration of the hospital staff, the kind of non-clinical hospital staff. So the non-clinical staff, such as attendants, right? You begin to see African Americans being hired as attendants in the 1940s, and earlier than that, you begin to see African American nurses being hired. It's not until 1955 that you have to actually have a Black physician on staff, and you don't see any Black administrators until the early 1970s.
Oh, interesting. I was so fascinated by this kind of continuity in the paternalism between slavery and then this mental health regime, right? This sort of paternalism, we have to sort of take care of these, primitive peoples and so on. What was the cure rate? One of our questions is, and what was the cure rate, so to speak, differential between Black and white patients? Because if you're sort of, if you then cure Blacks, then they're released in this
Right.
form, right? So how did that sort of match up?
Yeah, well, I don't have very good quantitative evidence for that over the duration of my study. But I will say that one of the things that I look at in the chapter that deals with treatment in the 20th century, or at least the first half of the 20th century, you look at the 1920s, the rates of um, I guess, release as recovered, right? So the rates of recovery are much higher for white male patients than they are for not only white female patients, but also African American male and female patients. So I actually looked at every annual reports from 1920 to 1930, and the release rate, or the discharge rate, I should say, as recovered, as opposed to the discharge rate as unrecovered, or the discharge rate through death, is very, very low for African Americans. I mean, we're talking about less than 5% of African Americans who were discharged in the 1920s were discharged as recovered, and I think that I do think that that really speaks to, as I said earlier, this this prioritization, right, of treatment of white patients, and and have lower expectations of what recovery would look like for African Americans, right? As long as African Americans were able to kind of get out and kind of make a living, working as a domestic, or working as a junk peddler or a rag seller or things like that, then they could be released, but they wouldn't necessarily be considered a recovery.
Okay, there is a question then, which is related to this, is whether the white patients, because you showed these striking images of the African American men and women doing this kind of menial labor at St. Elizabeth's, were the white patients also expected to do labor within the hospital?
No, they weren't. Well, they did labor. So for instance, there's a clear distinction in the kinds of roles or the kind of work done by Black and white patients in the dining rooms, right? So again, Black women and men primarily worked in the kitchen, whereas white patients might work in the dining room, right? Black patients almost exclusively worked in the laundry, in the hospital's laundry. I haven't seen any evidence that white patients worked. The only whites who worked in the laundry were supervisors or managers. But again, so this therapeutic paradigm of moral treatment also places an emphasis on make rest further and further into themselves, right? And so there was very much an emphasis on making sure that patients were, their days were kind of occupied doing something. For Black patients, that was doing menial labor. For white patients, especially white female patients, might be allowed making, having them do quilting, right? Sewing work, those kinds of things. So embroidery. So kind of classical middle class Victorian, you know, uh, uh, yeah.
Activities, yeah. This just resonates so much with the uh, prison industrial complex arguments that we're hearing, that we've heard quite a bit about in the last couple of years and continue to hear about, is that we employ the prison, so to speak, I mean, it's not a prison population, it's a hospital population, right? But we employ this kind of confined, incarcerated population to provide this labor. So do you see any resonances with your, of your work with those other arguments that are large scale, sort of call for prison reform today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this has been a long history, right? I mean, the prison industrial complex has always existed. And this goes back to, you know, not only prisoners laboring, but also, in laboring, because that fulfills this kind of therapeutic logic, right? That this is going to help them. This is going to reform them in some way, but also the labor that they're doing is materially benefiting the institution, right? And so at St. Elizabeth's, just as you have in other asylums or prisons in the late 19th century, and even some colleges for Black students, right? That the students would actually be making mattresses that would be sold, and so there's I think there's very much a connection between the labor that's being done by people who are institutionalized and the market.
Right. Another question just comes in, of course, that is completely related. I was thinking too, is it St. Elizabeth's, the name of this institution, right? So, what was the role of religion above and beyond the kind of moral question treatment of the way you described it? Was there any overt use of religion in at St. Elizabeth's?
Well, sure. They certainly provided religious services for patients. Those religious services were segregated, but St. Elizabeth's was not a Catholic institution. It was named St. Elizabeth's because it was situated on a tract of land that the owner designated as St. Elizabeth's, right? So there was.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So there were, in fact, from 5 different Protestant denominations regularly provide worship services, and then of course Catholic patients could also attend Mass. I wasn't able to determine whether or not there were services provided for Jewish patients, but
okay, it's a fascinating kind of overlay of confessional identity on racial identity, right, and then on class identity. It's fascinating. We have one question. If you could go a little bit more into the lobotomy issue at St. Elizabeth's, and how you would describe that in your remarks, and maybe go into it a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you. So as I said, William Freeman, who was one of the American popularizers of lobotomy, got his start at St. Elizabeth's. But what's very interesting is that he was there when William Allinson White was superintendent, and William Allinson White was actually very opposed to lobotomy. Right? So lobotomy was a very controversial, a controversial practice, a controversial technique. From the very beginning, and not all there was no kind of psychiatric consensus on the value of lobotomy. And William Allinson White, basically, and this is a paraphrase, paraphrasing, he said, "Why would we destroy the mind when we're really trying to cure it?" So Freeman actually did not perform any lobotomies at St. Elizabeth's. He didn't really begin performing lobotomies until he went into private practice, but he was still located in Washington, D.C. And it's not until the 1940s when you have another another superintendent who did allow the lobotomies to take place at St. Elizabeth's, but again, very sparingly. He was also somewhat skeptical of the use of lobotomy. I don't have any quantitative data on the use of lobotomy on, or the kind of racial differential of the use of lobotomy. That wasn't something that I was that interested in exploring this particular project.
It'd be interesting to know if the white brain was more worth being preserved than the black brain, right? So and how lobotomy played itself out there. Another question which goes along, or two more questions actually. I think people are really fascinated by the treatment regimes. Was shock therapy used? And you mentioned psychoanalysis as well, also a very controversial treatment regime, right? And so it would, and that seemed, I think you said, to be used or acceptable at St. Elizabeth's, right?
Yes.
So can you talk about that a little bit, and then about the coercive, maybe more coercive use of shock therapy?
Sure. Yeah. Well, absolutely. Shock therapy was used at St. Elizabeth's with some frequency, and you know, it continued to be used until you see the introduction of psychotropic drugs in the 1950s and in the 1960s. With respect to psychoanalysis, I mean, I think one of the arguments I make in the book is that with white patients, the psychiatrists at St. Elizabeth's, I think, very much harbored a belief that even though white patients might be resistant to the probing of their psyche, that deep down, you know, they really did want to be cured, right? And that didn't extend, that same belief didn't extend to Black patients, which is why I think what you see, and this is based on my consultation of scores of case files of Black patients. You really don't see that kind of deep kind of probing of the psyches of Black patients in order to really kind of get at these complexes, right? That serve as the basis of their psychosis. I think that the extent of talk therapy that existed with Black patients was really just trying to address the kind of surface symptoms of their psychoses, right? And also just attempting to get them to a position where they would be, or get them to a state where they would be able to kind of continue to labor either within the hospital, or they would be in a position to be released, maybe as recovered, maybe as not recovered, right? But they would still be able to be released and not be deemed as a threat to themselves or to their families.
So differential definitions of cure, mm-hmm. Right? I mean, what constitutes cure? We have just a few more minutes, and we do have a question about what you're working on now. So what's your newest project?
Yeah, so thank you for that. I mean, I think it's really connected a little bit to how I ended the talk, and the other argument that I didn't really get an opportunity to share, and that is one of the things I'm looking at is, or what I'm looking at is kind of the relationship between urbanization and mental illness. And by that, I mean how mental health experts and policymakers, as well as grassroots activists in the second half of the 20th century, thought about urbanization, kind of the social ills that racked poor, low-income communities, and the relationship between that and mental illness, and how they consequently sought to address the mental health care needs of so-called ghetto residents. So I'm looking at 3 cities: Chicago, Boston, and Washington, D.C. And I'm really focusing on, so for instance, the National Institute of Mental Health is very involved in addressing the mental health care dimensions of the urban crisis in the 1960s and the 1970s. And they really kind of tried to partner with grassroots organizations on the ground. But I'm also looking at the ways that these grassroots community organizations sought to leverage federal support for community mental health care that they themselves would kind of design and have a critical role in delivering, right? Just not allowing these outside the psychiatric professionals to come into their communities, but they really wanted to play a real key role in determining what mental health care would look like in their communities. And so that's kind of tied to the second argument in the book. I think there's generally a conventional wisdom that African Americans have a very hostile, indifferent, or kind of antipathetic relationship to psychiatry, and one of the things that I argue is that no, they don't. In fact, that they've always tried to engage psychiatry, but on their own terms, right? In ways that that gave them a say in what that mental health care would look like.
I mean, it's a completely unfair question to ask it right at the very end, but one of our questioners early on had asked whether you treat Native American or other minoritized populations in the book, and just as you were speaking now, I was thinking, well, that would be a natural question for this new project as well.
Yeah, I do not, but there were Native American patients at St. Elizabeth's, but and I talk about their existence there, but I really don't dive very deeply into their experiences. But yeah, I certainly think that is a history that is being told. There's a recent book called, I think, Vanished in Hiawatha, that looks at the Canton asylum in South Dakota, which was dedicated to Native Americans. And it closed in 1933 during the Depression, and then all of those patients were transferred to St. Elizabeth's.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, the further inquiry, all completely fascinating. Thank you so much for your presentation and for answering the questions, these wide-ranging questions as well. And thanks to everyone also who joined us this evening. This event has been recorded. It was so rich in detail that you can review it again. It'll be available on the National Humanities Center's YouTube channel. And I encourage you to click on the follow button and the notify bell in the right corner below this video to be notified of future discussions like this one with other videos from the center. Finally, please do join us for next Wednesday's evening's book club presentation, which will be fascinating because I know her work quite well, by Professor Kim Hall from Barnard College, who will be talking about Othello Was My Grandfather, Shakespeare, Race, and Visions of Freedom in the African Diaspora. So again, Martin, thank you very, very much. And thanks to everyone who joined us. Good evening to everyone. Stay safe and stay well.